Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening from a very changed world. This is Doug Brunke, CEO and founder of Global Chamber. This is a very important topic where we are in the world right now. It's always been an important topic, process orientation, how you should thinking about mapping and your business, having processes tightened down. I think my own experience with this over 20, 30 years is that it's not a really glamorous topic. There's many of us that feel very strongly about process and how important it is to the business, but there's a lot of people in the business very often don't get too excited about it. So here we are at a point in the world where process matters and what we're doing matters. And so pivoting to other things requires us to do different things in different ways. And that's going to require new ways of looking at it. And so we're going to be talking a little bit about that as in addition to just kind of the basics of, how do you map and do process orientation within your company to whether it's reducing risk, whether it's improving your profit and your bottom line. And we've got some speakers today that are the world's best at this. And we're very fortunate to have our first speaker, Joe Barkersteady, who I've known for quite a number of years. He's humbly put down as on his bio that he's a partner at Business Enterprise Mapping, but he's the owner. And I actually knew him before he owned the business and have been very fortunate to be able to know more about Joe and his business and the success he's had in helping companies be more successful. He inherited a business, or not inherited, he purchased the business. It was a great methodology at Business Enterprise Mapping, and he elevated it to a point where companies around the world are benefiting from what they're able to provide. And we were just learning that they're adjusting so that they're applying a lot of the things that they do online. So it can be done virtually, not just in person. The most amazing thing about Joe is not about Joe, his daughter, Amy. She, maybe you've probably seen the video of her parring the 16th hole at the Phoenix Open. It's the most amazing par you'll ever see. Amy Barkersteady, famous line, I got this. I got this. The amazing "I got this" line is something that you Google Amy Barkersteady, Google "I got this," and I bet if you Google "I got this," you'll find Joe and Amy and their amazing story. Joe, thank you for sharing your time. Really appreciate it.
Good morning, Doug. Hello, everybody. Thank you very much. Yes, I'm known now as Amy's dad, and Business Enterprise Mapping seems more of a hobby, while she seems more of a full-time job today, but we still managed to get the work done. So do you want to put the slides up, Doug?
Sure, we'll get that for you.
Okay, so I'll just give you a brief introduction of Business Enterprise Mapping and talk about how we help companies grow and improve their customer service, improve their efficiency, improve their quality. We go to the next slide, if you would, Doug. So we are a firm that began in 1993. We solely map businesses for a living. That's all we do. Our entire value proposition is the mapping of organization workflow for the purposes of improving performance. We've done over 300 enterprises over that time, a wide variety of size, shape, and industry. We are process experts, and through that expertise, we of course acquire industry expertise, but we see our broad industry capabilities as beneficial to any client because we're able to bring a very wide range of expertise into a particular situation. We have done and do a fair amount of public companies. We really like the organization that's rapidly growing that needs to get infrastructure in place in order to grow efficiently. That's a very, very common type of client that we service. And, process mapping and workflow management is foundational to running any business well. And so our methodology is well suited to all types of environments. And the lessons really are universal across industries. Okay, Doug. Yeah, so the value proposition for us is very, very clean. We map your workflow. Our philosophy is that the larger the swath of workflow that you study, the more likely you are to create larger gains. And so we know that mapping a task is useful, but not terribly valuable in the big picture. We know that mapping a process is better. We know that mapping a group of processes is better still. And so my first piece of advice is that you should look to the larger swath of work to get bigger gains. Things like your customer order value stream, let's say order to payment, or prospecting or lead generation to customer. In the human resources area, searching to onboarding to managing that employee. The larger the process flow you're able to study, the more valuable the findings you're going to create. The second piece of advice that I would offer up is those in your organization in general know your problems. Figuring out what's wrong is not that hard to do. All you have to do is ask the people on the front lines what their problems are and what prevents them from doing a better job. And in our world, we call those red clouds. And red clouds are the problems and opportunities that prevent you from achieving your goals. And when we map workflow with clients, we are looking for the identification of red clouds. And we know in the process of grabbing red clouds that about 50% typically are quick wins, where the client can implement changes, implement solutions to those red clouds in, let's say, 90 days without great budget requirements or senior leadership approvals. So that's the low-hanging fruit that every organization is able to grab quickly and make a difference in the business fast. And then lastly, putting standard processes in place over the long haul creates a much more sustainable competitive advantage. By running standard processes, measuring them, improving them, troubleshooting the cause and effect relationships over time, 2, 3, 5, 10 years, you're able to create and sustain a competitive advantage that is very difficult for those in your industry to match. Okay, Doug. And this is just basically the categories of work that we do for clients. It really all comes down to understanding and streamlining workflow. But what we do tends to feed the next two bullets. Managing rapid growth, we are frequently contacted by folks who are on a growth curve, a little bit frightened by the trajectory of hires relative to revenue gains, relative to expenses, and taking an early look at the workflow quality, the workflow efficiency, the workflow effectiveness can create multiple gains down the road. And then ultimately, much of the workflow process mapping work ends up in some sort of software or automation step. Either I want to acquire software that helps me automate an efficient workflow. I want to map the workflow to fix the software that I have. I want to troubleshoot the disconnects. Many clients buy software, install it without having a really good understanding of their actual business model. And what happens is the business model gets degraded for the sake of a standard software implementation, which ends up creating many workarounds, many excessive reviews and approvals, quite a bit of waste and quite a bit of time in the processing of work to the detriment of the customer and the profitability of the organization. And then sometimes clients will hire for compliance in heavily regulated industries. Process maps are an excellent way to document workflow. And process mapping is an excellent way to merge acquired companies, right? We're acquiring an intellectual property in a potential acquisition, and we want to understand how they do work, how that work matches up with the way we do work, and how we can get the best of both worlds. We know we collect an enormous amount of data, as you might expect, from all the clients that we work with, and the data tends to be pretty consistent across size, shape, and industry. We know that about 70% of all problems, all red clouds that are captured in our clients are due to process deficiencies. And it really breaks down into two main categories. About 50% of red clouds are due to a lack of defined process. We have different people doing the process different ways. We don't understand the cause and effect relationship, so we throw in reviews and approvals to try to mitigate those problems. And the result of that are complicated workflows. The other 20% are in boundaries. We up about, there you go, 20% in boundaries. These are the handoffs between desks, between departments, between processes. And very few client managers have a good understanding of their internal customers. So one of the next pieces of advice is you need to well understand your internal customers in order to create a successful value stream that satisfies your external customers. Most of the problems we find are due to the disconnects between problems created upstream and problems discovered downstream. And so those two areas are about 70% of all red clouds. Another 14% are in people. And that tends to come through lack of skills, unclear responsibilities, or sometimes lack of capacity, which is what drives the desire to standardize processes and automate. And then 13% is tools and equipment. So that tends to be the IT area. Folks often contact us saying we have an IT problem, and it really turns out you have a process problem that the technology doesn't fit well. Okay, Doug. And then lastly, what you're trying to do is you're documenting your business model, you're capturing the problems, you're learning from those problems, you're creating engagement. One of the primary drivers to good process mapping is the engagement of the people on the front lines doing the work to define and describe the problems with the work that they do. And so it's important to create teams in the front lines. You want people in process owner roles who know how the process works, know how folks contribute, know what the problems are. That creates the most powerful ultimate outcomes because I promise there are cases where people on the front lines do things differently than leadership imagines. Implementing the quick wins. So in a typical project, we easily find, I don't know, 300 or 400 red clouds. Of those 300 or 400 red clouds, maybe half are quick wins. And so there are always opportunities to do things in the short run to improve how you do business and to create sometimes substantial gains for your business just in fixing the dumb stuff that we didn't realize we were doing. And then finally, sustainability, right? You want to go beyond those 90-day quick wins. You want to continue to press on that infrastructure building, sometimes bringing solutions into sync with the process changes takes time. The difference between good and great in our client relationships is leadership having the perseverance and commitment to see this through over several years. There are always gains from process mapping because there are always insights that weren't there before, but sustainability really comes from leadership commitment. Okay, Doug. And then just examples, as I said, there sometimes are specific problems you're trying to solve. And that's certainly a good driver to why process mapping. I would encourage you, however, to think of process mapping and process strength as an asset to the organization, right? You buy equipment, you hire people, you purchase or lease facilities. All of those assets are made productive through process execution, right? We use people through process, we utilize equipment through process, and process is frequently underappreciated and understudied and underutilized relative to all that other money you spend. All of those assets are made productive through high quality processes. And that's it. This is an old quote that we like. We get brilliant results from average people managing brilliant processes, while our competitors get average or worse results from brilliant people managing broken processes. What we typically find when we begin work with clients is very brilliant people trying to overcome broken processes, right? And they're doing it different ways. Sometimes different divisions have different business models. And that intellect is really focused on workarounds and shortcuts versus building strength that is repeatable over time. So Doug, thank you. Hopefully that stuck to our 8-minute bogey here, and happy to play whatever role you like from here.
Okay. Well, I think we're going to need to ask some questions, because it looks like we're having trouble bringing on our next speaker. So send in your questions on, or send them to info@globalchamber.org, and we'll bring them here. The first question we have for you, Joe, is related to the concept of what you talked about, that many of the people that you work with are growing, which
Right.
a lot of the things that they're doing are ideas and maybe are not necessarily operationalized yet. So how do you map that it's not fully defined, or it's mapping a feature that doesn't exist yet?
Yeah, so actually we do a fair amount of that in clients. I'm not sure I've ever met a client that had every process filled out that they wanted to operate. And so we have a depth of experience in process design from virtually every department, every function. And so rather than, say, documenting a process that already exists, you would bring the group together, create a process that you desire. It is really a first pass that you then operate, troubleshoot the difficulties, and continue to perfect over time. But processes are fundamental, right? You have a supplier that provides some input, a process that transforms it into some better output and provides it to a customer. And so when you think of process design, you really are thinking of the fundamentals of what's the purpose of my process, what am I taking in, what am I producing, and what's the best way to do that. And then you just create the new design from that fundamental foundational element, and then you put it in place and find out what you did wrong and you improve it.
What do you do when that process is pretty much in someone's head? And I'm also thinking about the concept of, if a company is pivoting to something, right now there are companies out there that are thinking about, well, gee, maybe we should do this or we should do that.
Right.
How do you, what are the steps to take relative to that? Undoubtedly, people have already intellectualized a lot of that in their head.
Yeah. So the way we do that is we facilitate a team meeting. So our process is to pull a group together of subject matter experts. Let's say you've got something in your head as you described, which is also a very common scenario that we find. Our technician, or what we call program director, maps real time while facilitating the room. And so what we're doing is we're simultaneously running a meeting and then diagramming on the screen with the group what we're hearing. So it's a very interactive, very immediate feedback-oriented process. So in just a matter of a couple hours, you're able to rough things out very, very quickly that are in people's heads. And then you can around a couple more passes and fine tune. The foundational element is we get the right people in the room that have the idea, have the subject matter expertise, and then you're able to pull it out of them and diagram it in a way that's very understandable and very easy to move forward with.
Got it. That's great. And one of our the people that are observing this is actually one of our speakers. So we're having a little trouble with the right link. So Brad, on that, Cesar, if you could send him the right link, and then we'll get him here on stage here in a moment. So we're kind of in the wrong space right now. Let me check out here what other questions we have for you. By the way, I earlier had said about I got this, so I did try actually Googling that. So I would suggest Google I got this Amy, and so I got this apparently is some country song or something like this. But if you do I got this Amy, you'll start to see a litany of amazing things that Amy Bockerstedt has done. Really extraordinary. I would also want to say, speaking of extraordinary, Joe was the inspiration for our League of Extraordinary. Actually want to try to do these virtually now, and because that one is sold out, basically full, we've added another one a week. Very valuable way for business service providers who handle sophisticated, like Joe does, to get together, share what they do, and then invariably they know very few of the same companies, but by knowing what each one not competitive, they're able to say, hey, my client needs process help or process mapping, and you need to talk to Joe. And so the introduction is made and business referral is happening. So Joe was the extraordinary service years ago that started that weird name that now has moved forward into Global Chamber. And last year we've been doing every month, and now we've escalated it to twice a month because it's had so much value for our members. So Joe, thanks for the extraordinary inspiration.
You bet. Well, we go way back. We go back before the Global Chamber. So I remember the early days still. And by the way, Amy's video has been viewed by 45 million people. Right. It's the largest golf video in the history of the PGA Tour. So bigger than Tiger, bigger than Rory, bigger than anybody you might imagine. So pretty crazy.
Yeah, definitely check that out. It's an incredibly inspirational story that you're going to really enjoy. A question from the audience: What are the ways to map growth trajectory, especially operating at the seed stage?
Yeah, so you're really looking out at that point. So we think in terms of 3 states of a process. We have what is commonly called the current state, and the current state is, of course, what you're doing today, and that's in a more mature company, and that's where we have a process we're operating that we want to document. The near state is that design of a process that we want to move to that we're not yet doing. And so that's that conversation we had a minute ago where we're designing a process we desire but don't yet have in place. A future state process is envisioned maybe, in the future, obviously, maybe 2 years to 5 years out. It probably has a shift in technology associated with it. There's a paradigm shift in what our capabilities are at that point. And so that's more of an aspirational process where we're attempting to move the company. So now you're loading your vision into that desire, recognizing that it's going to take a series of events and a series of maybe technology changes to get us there.
Okay. Great. And just maybe to facilitate the conversation, I see, Brad, you need to log out of the audience. So you just get out of there, and then Cesar has a different link for you to click so that we can hear you. So log out of where you are and come back in through the new link, and Cesar, you've sent him the new link there. So so I appreciate that. That's a great answer, and I think that's a touch point. A lot of times on the news side, where people are thinking about, it's hard to imagine, and they may not be thinking in those early days about how to map the process. When should a company, or what are the kind of the maybe key milestones within?
Yeah, that's a great question. So fairly early, I don't think if you're a single person with everything in your head, you're there yet. But the minute you start adding employees and you start to fill out your departmental infrastructure, you need to put in at least elementary processes to start to run the business. Once you have a business model, right? So let's start with that. Once you have a business model and you start to hire employees, the sooner you put standard process in place, the sooner you will run that business effectively and manage growth better. What often happens, what we see a lot is, I'll make a number up, you're at 22 people and things feel like chaos, right? Because everybody's doing extraordinary things to try to make the business run. And you would be far better off to pause. Doesn't take that long to do. Get stuff out of people's heads onto a process map, and then start to solve the red clouds and troubleshoot the opportunities that allow you to run the place better. The payoff is enormous, especially at that early stage. And it feels difficult to do because everybody feels overworked, right? And you are adding additional work over that short period of time to get that stuff down. But the value is you're buying time on the back end. Once you're through this exercise, now those 22 people have far, far greater capacity than they ever had going into it.
Got it. No, that makes a lot of sense. Kind of carrying that through, another question is, how should a company cope with their processes brought about by some sort of external situation? COVID-19 might be an example, right?
Right.
You've got processes, you've got a business model, you know what your value proposition is, and then something significant happens. Perhaps nothing ever as significant as COVID-19.
Right.
It's too big of a topic to cover in a short amount of time.
Well, I'll say a couple of things. I'll say I do think there's an infrastructural business model shift that comes out of this, right, in the country. And I do think all of us will be doing business, well, not all of us, many of us will be doing business differently after the dust settles. Doug and I were talking about this before we came on air, how our business is moving faster to online virtual delivery. We have done pandemic response process maps, believe it or not. And in a couple of major metropolitan areas in the US. So that is really a function of disaster planning and disaster recovery, right? And what do you do in the case of a business disruption? And that's something that gets put on the back burner in most situations, but there are processes out there that provide for disaster planning, disaster recovery.
Okay. Have you worked with some of those in the past?
We have, yeah. That's a more unusual stream of process maps, but we have done those, yeah. As I said, we've done pandemic response in a couple of major metropolitan areas.
Okay, very good. Like a preparation type activity.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
I think we've got Brad on the line. Brad, unmuted. Sorry for the confusion between the links. There's two different links. And so I think you're there, right?
Yes.
Okay, great. Hey, Brad is the project director at Goldratt Consulting, or he's one of the key project directors. And one of the great things about the Goldratt approach is theory of constraints. Again, something that I very strongly believe in. Brad does some really fantastic work through that. And so you're here to tell us a little bit more. Look forward to hearing about it.
Yes. And I assume from what I saw with Joe you're running the presentation?
Absolutely. Here we go.
Yes, hi, my name is Brad Cartier. I'm one of the project directors with Goldratt Consulting, and I just wanted to talk a little bit about how TOC approach is process improvement. And you can go ahead and the big key about theory of constraints is it applies focus. Frequently, because my background is manufacturing engineering, we will use lean techniques, we'll use agile techniques, but we'll use it where we believe it's going to give us the largest impact. The other thing, kind of piggybacking on what Joe had said about you get more benefit the broader you go, we try to do everything we can. Well, our goal is to get the whole system perspective. So you look at the whole system, not just subparts of the system. And then because some of our systems, especially in larger companies, can be quite large, where do we actually focus? Because if you think, just walk out on a decent sized manufacturing floor, there's probably thousands of things you could do today to improve part of the process. But what we're really looking for is that focus to help us leverage what we do gives us the biggest benefit for the effort or money we put into it. So go ahead. So how we go through this is by using the theory of constraints 5 focusing steps, and they're very simple. The first thing you need to do is identify the system's constraint. Understanding where this is allows us to provide our focus. The other step, and there's kind of some misnomers about it, everybody just says identify, exploit, subordinate, and elevate. It really is not exploit, it's decide how to. It is a management decision. So once we understand where the constraint in the organization is, we must decide how we can get the most out of that part of the process. And that's really a decision. These are activities and decisions we will make to ensure that we're getting the most through the system. Then the big key is subordinate everything else to this decision, these decisions. So once we understand where it is, what we're going to do about it, we need the other people to get in line. So you can imagine, I'll get to it on the next one, but next slide. But if we continue to allow each parts of the system act independently, no, you can go back. Thank you. Because yeah, Doug, it's just kind of down in the center, but we'll get through it. But once we decide the decisions we're going to make to get the most out of that system, we can't have other functions, other groups within the system acting independently. So if you think about where the constraint is, we need to make sure that they have the full kit, that when they start something, they actually have everything they needed, or they're not working on bad parts or some of these other things. So we want to make sure that if we want to increase flow or improve productivity, that the rest of the system is aligned with the fact that we do have a constraint and we are making these decisions to get the most through it. And so you need to think about how your system or your part of the system interacts with the fact that it feeds or takes away from, takes stuff away from the constraint, and how best to utilize your time and effort to make sure that we're getting the most through the constraint. Step 4 is elevate the system's constraint. This is the most interesting part of the process, because basically what it says is if the constraint isn't sufficient to meet demand, we need to get more of it. And that usually takes an investment. You would not believe how many times, especially in smaller organizations, if they have the money, it's identify and elevate, identify and elevate. It's like, very frequently in the exploitation and the subordination steps, we frequently get enough capacity to meet the demand that's being placed on the system. But there just seems to be this trigger, well, we've got the money, let's go get more. And we really don't suggest you do that, because in many senses, it's just a waste. The big key is, warning, do not allow inertia to become the system's constraint. When a constraint is broken, go back to step 1. So frequently, when we're working with clients over 5-10-year periods, through those periods, something will change internally. There'll be a process improvement, maybe a software thing that helps out. Maybe there's an engineering change. Demand changes, so demand shifts. And all of a sudden the constraint is no longer where it is. Well, if we're making those management decisions on how to exploit a specific area and everybody else is subordinated to it, but it switches, you're going to find out that you're going to get a very disruptive and chaotic system very quickly, because you're acting as a system that's not matching where the current constraint is. And so it's imperative that you go back and say, okay, where is it currently again? What are we going to do about it? How does everybody align to that thinking? And so we can continue to move on. Okay, Doug, next one. So the whole premise of theory of constraints is very simple. Systems, organizations are like chains, and what determines the strength of a chain? Of course, it's its weakest link. So when we look at the system where we've got the inputs, resources A can do 20 units a day, resources B can do 16, resources C 10, 14, and 18, and so on. How much can we really plan on average to get out of this system daily? Hopefully you guys are all seeing, yes, you can go to the next one. Yeah. Of course, it's the element of C, the group of people working in the C work center, however you want to define this. So when we look at these systems, we can say basically, hey, we should not be expecting to get more out of the system than 10 units. Now, realistically, if you think about this, what happens if you measure A totally on their efficiency, B totally on their efficiency? What you're going to see is a system that gets clogged up very quickly because they continue to release work into the system at the rate that the gating operation can allow it, not knowing that we have this constraint C. So realistically, we should not be doing anything to release work into the system faster than what C can actually handle it. More importantly, if you start thinking about what is the damage to resources D and E if they're measured on efficiencies, when they, you know, their biggest problem is running over to C and screaming that they don't have enough work and they're getting penalized, right? So we need everybody to understand what the system can do, how we're going to manage it. And as far as improving the system, it does not make a lot of sense to focus any efforts on improving A, B, D, or E, correct? What we really need to do is figure out what would happen in C. Now, if you have a really definitive model of cost accounting in your system and you say, hey, I can get 2 more units out of C, which is 20% more out of the system, but I need to take 4 units away from A because they're going to do more work. They're not as proficient at it, but we're going to take them from 20 to 16. Well, cost accountants would say, no, that's going to cost us 2 more minutes. We're going to be losing money on these products. We're going to be losing money on these processes. And the reality is we're not spending any more money. Group A is still being paid the same. They're still getting what they need to get done. They're outperforming C. Realistically, they've got the protective capacity to constantly keep C full and being able to produce at 12 more units. So this is the concepts behind theory of constraints. Identify where the constraint is. So decide how we're going to exploit it. What can we do to tweak it to get it 10, 20, 30% more through there? And more importantly, subordinate the rest of the system. We release work into the system at the rate with which the system can perform. And that's all based on the abilities of the C resource. Go ahead, Doug, next slide. And so the other key thing we look at, and I think from the parts I heard from Joe as well, that we're looking at is processes will go across functions. And it's amazing to the extent that functions build these perfectly built silos, and they get these great metrics to make sure that that silo performs as best it can. But again, if C is in one of those different functions, it's a very delicate exercise working with clients to help them understand that you can't perform as a function as efficiently as you would like, because all you're doing is damaging a part of the function that may really be the constraint in the system. And this works for manufacturing. It works for processing loan applications, insurance claims, insurance applications. Whether you're pushing paper or pushing parts, this process still works the same. And really what we're looking at on the right side of this is every organization is a group of systems, HR systems, production systems, distribution systems, however you want to look at it. And what we really need to do is make sure all of the functions, all the systems are aligned at making sure that they get the most through the overall system. And by knowing where the constraints are and aligning everybody to that and setting up their metrics and setting up their rocks, whatever you're doing these days, is aligned to the knowledge of where the constraint is. And I believe that's all I had is, again, this is where the systems view comes in. Is that
Okay.
sufficient? 8 minutes?
Gotcha.
TOC and a long elevator
I
trip?
appreciate it. Yeah, no, good information. The first question we have for you is what happens when you've got a market disruption like we have today, where the constraint is on the markets? How does that reverberate through the system?
Well, certainly the first thing you should do is not overproduce, correct? I mean, unless you can foresee that when this limitation is removed, that demand is going to spike. You know, when I watch these things, interestingly enough, I'm working currently with P&G, talking to them internally. They've got to get as much toilet paper and stuff to the customer as they can, but they know in about 3 or 4 months when the dust settles, they're going to have a supply chain that's backed up and is no longer going to have the requirements because people get, you know, a year's worth of toilet paper in their houses. So the big key is first, slow the system down if you need to match demand, so you're not creating demand that does not have a foreseeable need. There's actually, I wish I still had some of the photographs of it. I remember having a photograph, one of the, what was it, like the early 2000s when the auto industry started to slow down pretty heavily, when we had a major economic slowdown back then. And what Toyota never did was shut off the spout. And there were pictures of thousands and thousands of Toyota cars and vans sitting in a desert in Australia, because that's where they were going to keep it, because they would retain longer, you know, rather than sitting in humid areas and stuff like that. But so 2 points. One, slow the system down, understand how you're going to deal with it if the system changes. But more importantly, then you've got to work on the value proposition to the market, right? So if the constraint is in the market, which most organizations can move to pretty rapidly, is your ability to capture market share becomes the constraint. And that's where you need to start working on your value proposition, your message, and things like that. How do you drive more demand? And that should be the primary focus of the leadership of the organization. Don't be yelling at somebody to get the cost down in production, because they should be slowing down a bit, but more or less, how do we create more demand? And that should be the primary focus, because the constraint is now in your ability to capture market share or more of the market.
It's a really good point for those watching, and I think it'll become, I think, more clear in coming days. Is what Brett's saying is, you know, there's usually a shift, right, in terms of maybe the offerings or something is changing. And invariably, this has come up many times in the last couple of days for me talking to members, is they're making shifts in what they're offering. And so they, instead of the cutting back on sales and marketing, there's going to be a moment here where people are going to realize they now need to do more or different sales and marketing as soon as people are willing to write a check, right? And there's still some openings in the community. So the sales marketing function, one of the great things about theory of constraints is it argues against the lean principles of, hey, if you've got to cut back, cut everything 10% or cut everything 30%. That's totally wrong. And I think, you know, I think Brad will agree. Theory of constraints, basically, don't do that. That's really dumb. You know, think about, you know, where the constraint is and protect that constraint.
Yeah, my example, if you cut 10% across the board and you cut the C unit of 10, now you're going down to 9 units per day, and that's much detrimental if you could cut. But I mean, realistically, people have varying capacities, even in project environments and other things. So there are places you might be able to cut, but like you said, the value proposition, I think the coolest thing I've seen recently is Governor Abbott in Texas has allowed restaurants to deliver alcohol with the meal. Since they're going to deliver or take out only, they're actually letting in Texas people or go to their favorite restaurants, buy their favorite drinks with their food and take it away or have it delivered. So they're actually now being able to deliver alcohol in Texas. I mean, there's a guy who's thinking, how do we make sure that these businesses continue to make as much money as they can?
Great example of making the adjustments along the way.
Yes.
There's another question from Emmy that Joe's answered privately, but I'm going to open it up so that you and Joe can both answer this more publicly to everybody. Emmy asks or mentions that she's a global senior product manager in the IT digital space. Often we define the process, but adoption of the process takes longer because there are legacy systems, legacy that what would be the practice and approach to speed up the implementation process in those cases, which is almost always the case.
Mm-hmm. Well, again, we still look for the constraint. If she's talking from a project area, we see that we're always looking for, usually it's a critical path from traditional project management, but TOC has an approach called critical chain, where we look at resource dependencies and all these other things to really determine what is the longest chain of dependent events. But, really understanding where the critical path is, what the interactions of the feeding chains and stuff are, and being able to manage when they start to impact each other, if they're slowing down or speeding up, and make sure we're going through step 3 and subordinating everybody to the longest path to complete the project is real key. As far as legacy systems and all these other things, oh boy, I don't want to get it. We have processes, Doug, you may have heard of the thinking processes, where we use conflict diagrams and everything to help everybody understand, are we going to subordinate this new process to the legacy system, or can we shut part of the legacy system down? You go through these decision processes, and realistically, I think Joe's team does a great job at making sure that there is the proper documentation. How should this process work? How should it look? What does good look like in the future? If we can define what does good look like in the future and get everybody aligned to that very common goal, then it should be easy for us to determine what parts of things should we show up. More importantly, if we can describe to the users that are going to use the IT function, what does good look like? How's this going to work for you? Then at least, especially the testers and stuff in the market groups or wherever you're releasing the information or product to or process to, get their feedback, make sure everybody's aligned to what is the goal of the change. A lot of times, I think the old adage works. In order to improve, we must change, but not every change is an improvement. So sometimes we need IT to understand that as well. And we've worked with IT groups. We don't blame the IT group. Frequently, they get requests that are not thoroughly vetted, I guess is probably the best way I could say it. So making sure that the users are getting what they need and going through that decision-making process versus just, hey, I'd like an app that would do this. Wait a second, some of this can be done by a process, some of this can be done by a software solution, and get agreement on how, really what does good look like in the end state.
Got it. Joe, you want to add to that as well? I saw you.
Yeah, so I'll just echo what Brad said, but I'll add a couple of points. So this is a really common problem that we see, and really a couple of elements to it. When we are documenting a process through a process map, we are very tactically identifying where the legacy system impedes progress, so to speak, where it creates a red cloud for how you want to run the process. We will then bring the legacy representative into the room, let's say a software vendor or an IT group internally or subject matter expert or whatever it may be. And our experience is that there are often things you can do to help immediately. This, I tell clients all the time, this is not a magic show. We're not going to change the world in a week. But there are surprisingly changes that can be made if we just get the right people in the room and look at the problem together. As Brad indicated, IT's often given us a problem without a real specification for what's taking place and what the solution looks like. When you put the technology people in the room with the business people looking at specifically how a process works, it's not infrequent that solutions can be put in pretty quickly. Then the second element to that is it then helps you critically prioritize the most important, bigger challenges over time, right? By being able to look at this so granularly, we're able to determine what's really important to the process, what's really important to the business, and what isn't as important to the business. So when we look out, let's say over the next 2 years, it helps to prioritize the system requirements in terms of bigger solutions that are going to take more time, knowing that the priorities are driving the most value for the business, right? And so we parse it out into 2 categories. What can we do, let's say, in less than 6 months that makes a difference, or sometimes even in a week? And then what are the bigger projects that we got to tackle as a business, and is the juice worth the squeeze?
Got it. That makes sense. Great answers, guys. So here's a question for both of you. Well, our favorite topics. I learned today that Arizona is the state in the United States that's most worried about toilet. Number one, with number 2 or something. I don't know what that
Yes.
joke. So, but in terms of concern, that's bad because it's running out. A publication yesterday that showed older people in Arizona up at 5 a.m. in the morning to basically go get that and other things. Referring to that example, it's not. I mean, it's fairly typical of run on a product. It's an unusual example, but on a run on a product, how does a producer, how does the market react to that? So, if you're a toilet paper producer, do you ramp up production and invest in that production, given that it may be coming back down fairly quickly? Do you outsource? And then how does the market react to something like that? What are some of the considerations that you take care of?
Yeah. So first and foremost, it will wreak havoc on the provider, right? The first thing that's going to happen is the supply chain is going to be sucked dry with whatever cushion exists at the beginning, right? And I think we're experiencing that now as I see store shelves, some aisles are completely wiped out and some things are being replenished. That's really a function of what was in the supply chain already. Okay. Once that happens, then the question is, what's your surge demand or what's your surge supply capability against that demand? So in the short run, producers will see high costs in order to maximize capacity. So you're going to see folks running full steam pretty inefficiently and generally. And then at some point you'll hit the wall where the demand will be satisfied. We've got our year's stock of toilet paper and we're finally think that's going to be enough, right? And then you're going to see a horrible, horrible hangover on the other end. And I don't personally think there's a way to avoid this. I think this is one of the costs of the economy that we're going to see through this. And what's going to happen is those production facilities that ramped up to produce all this extra demand are going to be shut down for a year or whatever that extended period of time is, as the system works through that excess inventory now at the consumer level, so to speak. And there's no magic answer here. If you can ramp up and make money in the short run, you're obviously going to do it. I have a friend who's configuring everything to make hospital gowns and hospital bedding. It turns out that most of the country's hospital gowns and bedding come from China. We're not getting them. So he's reconfiguring his entire factory to make goods for hospitals. You're going to see some of that. When it all settles down, though, you're going to have to ramp down as quickly as possible, and there's probably going to be hangover costs that are going to be difficult.
Got it. We take a look at hand sanitizers. You've got now ventilators where
right.
Our companies shifting production or talking about shifting production to create to manufacture ventilators. Anything you want to add to that, Brad?
Yeah, no, I agree with Joe. Again, when you can shift, I mean, having some knowledge of a toilet paper maker, they generally maintain a certain amount of protective capacity, and at best, how quickly can they really add more equipment? I mean, a packaging line might take at world-class speed about 90 days to get everything hooked up and running. And because the realist, what's sad is the real demand has not changed. We're still all going about the same levels we used to. What's just changed is the sporting part, and how you deal with that is going to be different. So, I agree with Joe, where and when you can shift to meet a market demand that exists out there. Something specific like toilet paper may be just people got to calm down so the system can restabilize. There are certain things you can do. I know this is really weird, but back when I worked in the 90s for 3M, they make the medical tape. There was a diet fad in Japan that they said if you wrapped your first 2 fingers on your eating hand with 1-inch medical tape, you'd lose weight. And we had to transform the tape cutting equipment to take rolls that we'd already cut for 2-inch, 3-inch, 4-inch, and all these other stuff, and just figure out how to cut down sizes just to ship to Japan, just because it was, let's face it, it was not a real need. I don't think anybody can justify taping 2 fingers to, I guess there's a chopstick thing, but just forced them to eat slower or eat a little less because they got so frustrated. But, there we could transform the plant very quickly. Some places, I don't think you can make so much of a shift like in toilet paper, but certainly like Joe's example or 3M's example, you can shift your operations and meet a need. And ideally, the United States comes to its senses, and Joe's clients and stuff that are retransforming and making things that are important, excuse me, for the health industry will be rewarded long term and say, hey, this is the type of stuff we still need to make here.
Got it. But really appreciate both of you taking the time today. It's a crazy time to carve out an hour for you, and we really appreciate that. Very busy. Thanks all for everybody around the world for in today. We'll have very likely a blog post and a recording of this out in the future. We have always done virtual events, and we're doing more and more of them. I mentioned about the League of Extraordinaries tomorrow that's already full, but we have another one. We scheduled 2 of them in April. So if you're a member, check those out. And then we have regular conversations like this on a variety of topics that are important. And it's an important time now to stay engaged, to listen, to understand, digest, analyze. And for your business, you may need to do some pivoting right now, and more than likely you will need to. So it's an important time to be thinking through the idea, talking to other members of Global Chamber who can that you can bounce ideas off of and make sure that they're on the mark before you start moving forward with them. So guys, thanks for all attendees, and have a great rest of your day. Take care.
Take care, Doug. Be well, everybody.
Take care, Doug.
Take care. Bye. Be well.